Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Beyond Budget Headlines. Today we will take you to the expenditure side of the budget and talk about some of the areas which have not been India's top expenses but are now in the spotlight because of the certain recent events. We are joined by our editorial director and policy expert, Mr. Ashok Kumar Bhattacharya, who will help us look beyond the numbers and understand why government needs to loosen its purse strings in this pandemic budget. Hello, AKB. Very nice to see you.
Yeah, same here.
We are coming closer to your favorite time of the year. The budget is...
That's right.
We're also getting closer to the vaccine rollout, of course. And there has been a lot of discussion and speculation around what the government plans to spend on vaccination drive and overall on the health sector, which is now getting its much deserved spotlight because of the COVID. So while we have pulled out this data from last year's budget, and the trend, as you know, sir, is broadly the same most years, and health is not on the top of agenda, not in the top three at least. What should we expect from the budget this year for the health sector? Because it is also a concurrent subject. It's in the state list as well.
Actually, it is not in just the top three items of the central government expenditure. It comes as low down level as the 10th largest expenditure by the center comes to health. But the center, given the pandemic situation, has to spend more. So I would expect that this year's budget to be presented next month will probably have a special item under the health ministry's budget where you see some money being allocated for financing or providing assistance to states for rolling out the vaccination program.
Besides vaccination, should the budget take a long-term view of the health sector? Things like universal health insurance are being talked about. Government has declared the digital health mission as well.
Both health and education, which do not receive the kind of attention that they deserve, should get more outlay. Right now, what happens is that if you look at the government's expenditure, budget, almost a fourth of the government's budget is used up for interest payments, and then you have got around 7.5% of its total budget outlay, and that goes in defense, which is the second big item. And the third big item is subsidies. So you can see that how the real programs, the health and education, they come way down in the government's priority list of expenditures. You have pensions, is a big item which accounts for around 7% of the government's total budget. Almost 2 trillion rupees is provided for pensions of the retired government employees. So therefore, health and education, unfortunately, do not get the kind of importance it deserves. But the most important thing in health, since you asked me about health, is that the government must create world-class healthcare infrastructure in the country, and not just in the major cities, but also in tier 2 and tier 3 and tier 4 towns. Which the governments in the last few years have begun to do, setting up what they call the All India Institutes of Medical Sciences, which are both research as well as hospital caregiving centers. But I think that process has to be expedited. Healthcare infrastructure, and particularly in the primary healthcare sector, you will have to have more facilities. But it is not just the center, but the states will also have to take more proactive steps to implement your healthcare programs.
Yeah, in fact, states also have to increase their spending in the sector. Only then will we be able to make some dent. So I want to come to defense, but before that, something about the capital expenditure, which the government has said will remain a key focus area in the upcoming budget in order to revive the demand and to boost the growth. If we look at the numbers that have come so far and compare the actuals to the target capital expenditure for this financial year, it's almost 22%, and the gap has widened. So can you elaborate on what these numbers mean? And
You know,
yeah.
when the budget was rolled out for the current year, it was a fairly ambitious budget. The overall growth in expenditure was expected to be around 13%. Now, as you know, expenditure has two components. One is the capital expenditure, which is spent in creating assets that will have long-term returns for the economy in terms of growth as well. And then there is a large chunk of the expenditure is called the revenue expenditure, which is for running the existing schemes, paying wages, and running those schemes both at the state and central level. Now, out of 30 trillion rupees of total expenditure, almost 26 trillion rupees is meant for revenue expenditure, and a very little, around 4 trillion rupees, is meant for capital expenditure. And that is a problem in itself, that we are not spending enough on creating long-term assets which can create better returns for the economy. The current year was a pandemic year, and you saw that the government decided to increase capital expenditure. It was the increase, as you said, 22%. But if you add 25,000 crore extra, which was announced, actually the increase becomes more.
Even.
But let that be on the side for the moment. Out of 22% growth, what you have seen in the first 8 months, the government has grown its capital expenditure only by 13%. And if you look at the revenue expenditure in the first 8 months of the current financial year, the growth is just about 3.6%. Now, as a result, the total expenditure of the government in the first 8 months is just around 4.7% or 4.5% growth. So therefore, the government's ability to spend more resources, even though it is there in the budget, is severely constrained. So therefore, it is very important that we reform the way we spend money so that, as they say, bang for the buck has to be more.
What do you think of the defense expenditure in light of the threat that India sees from China? I mean, obviously, we've been talking about making India the global manufacturing hub and taking the position that China might be vacating. But it doesn't seem to be going that way. And add to that, troops being deployed near Ladakh and the whole standoff with China.
As I told you, that defense is the second biggest item of expenditure in the government budget. I think current year the government is supposed to spend around 3.2 lakh crore or 3.2 trillion rupees. But I doubt the entire money with the external situation not being very looking good, especially after the Chinese aggression. Government has to provide more money for defense. As a matter of fact, the 15th Finance Commission was asked to find out how the government can earmark a certain portion of this defense expenditure from the government's tax revenues, on which the states will not have any demands. Right now, as you know, the tax revenues are shared with the states. So that we will see on 1st of February. But I think there are two problems with defense. One is how do you make sure that the money that is allocated is spent? And second, you need to provide more defense resources to acquire weapons and other armaments.
Absolutely, sir. Very nicely pointed out, sir, the sectors that India needs to spend, and obviously, as you mentioned, cooperation of states is required for the health sector. A lot of opportunities as well, since so much of capex is still left to be spent. Thank you so much for joining us today, AKB.
If you like this video, do share it and subscribe to Business Standard. We are also present on all social media platforms, so do follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at rchitravanshi with any suggestions and feedback you may have on the show. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay tuned.